Hello, good evening and welcome to Biz1st Review 360, your weekly roundup of the top business news and developments impacting the Sri Lankan economy. This week in Sri Lanka began with confusion, fear and suspicion, accompanying the passage of the controversial Provincial Council's Elections Amendment Act, which was passed with a two-thirds majority in Parliament. Anti-corruption watchdog Transparency International Sri Lanka has already flagged the lack of consultation and apparent absence of procedure in adopting this legislation. Election monitors have warned that this is an attempt to delay and postpone provincial council elections. Meanwhile, inflation spiked in August, and this was followed by an increase in the price of domestic gas cylinders. President Maithripala Sirisena has ordered a 100% levy on imported big onions in order to assist local farmers. That's a roundup of the week in Sri Lanka. Let's take a look at some of the top stories from the business arena.
The central bank said exports grew 14% to $1,016 million in July 2017 from a year ago. According to the central bank, the growth in exports was driven mainly by industrial exports followed by agricultural exports. This is the second time this year that exports exceeded $1 million. However, export earnings from leather, travel, goods, footwear, and precious stones and jewellery has seen a decline in July 2017. However, the trade deficit widened in July 2017 compared to July 2016 due to higher import expenditure and tourist earnings declining marginally while workers' remittances increased.
Earlier this week, the central bank held its key rates steady, saying past steps were keeping inflation and credit growth under control as policymakers focus on supporting an economy hit by extreme weather. As expected, the bank kept the standing deposit facility rate at 7.25% and standing lending facility rate at 8.75%. Central Bank Governor Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy said economic growth may be around 4 to 4.5% of gross domestic product in 2017, with higher growth in the second half.
Well, as you know, in the first half of the year we got 3.9% growth. It will pick up in the second half. For instance, I think GSP Plus should begin to kick in by the fourth quarter. There's also been some rain, and the agricultural preparation work for the Maha will create some activity. All in all, while there will be some pickup, growth will be somewhere for the year overall, will be somewhere between 4 and 4.5%.
Economic growth has continued to be affected by extreme weather conditions and weak external demand. Dr. Kumaraswamy said the budget deficit may overshoot the target of 4.6% to reach 5% due to government spending related to the drought.
Historically, that has been the normal pattern. But we are now in a new paradigm. We are exposed to rating agencies and international capital markets in a way that we have never been exposed before. We need to maintain our ratings to be able to raise the money at reasonable cost to repay the stock of debt that we have already incurred. And the most critical, the main source of instability in the system has always been the budget deficit. If we lapse back into our old ways, the costs will be far greater than we have ever experienced in the past. Because then we will have serious difficulty in accessing the money we need at a reasonable cost. And in the end, we will have to have very serious adjustments, very painful adjustments. So it's extremely important that the government maintains the trajectory of fiscal consolidation that it has embarked upon. It's done well so far. This year there will be some slippage, but that was because of the floods and the drought. But so far they've done okay. This year wasn't planned for 3.5. It was planned for 4.6, right? It might be about 0.5% more. But that's because of the drought and the floods. Maybe 5.
Stay tuned to Biz1st Review 360. On the other side of this break, we're talking economics, specifically reorienting Sri Lanka's economy with Kitmina Hewage of the Institute of Policy Studies. Back to Biz1st Review 360. The Institute of Policy Studies, or IPS, in its most recent economic outlook suggested that Sri Lanka's economy is in urgent need of reorientation. What does the think tank mean by reorientation? To talk about this and more, we've got one of the authors of that economic outlook, Kitmina Hewage, to illuminate us. Kitmina, illuminate us. Why does IPS feel that the Sri Lankan economy is at this stage in urgent need of reorientation?
Thanks, Nadeep. It's not just a matter of where the economy is right now, but rather an accumulation of factors over the years. So successive Sri Lankan governments have based their development strategies on loans and kind of debt. This has worked for Sri Lanka while it was a low-income country, because it qualified for concessionary loans from development partners like the World Bank and other international organizations. But since graduating to low-middle income status in 2010, we no longer qualified for those concessionary loans, which meant that we had to borrow at market prices or market interest rates. So continuing the strategy of debt-led development no longer is sustainable for Sri Lanka because of this fact that we no longer apply for concessionary loans, and when borrowing at high interest rates, we have two options. One is so that our economy grows within from domestic sources at a rapid rate, which the Sri Lankan economy hasn't. The second option is in terms of our exports. We need to develop our export sector so that our export revenue increases as well. But that hasn't happened either, because for the last 20 years or so, our export sector has been diminishing over the years, and our export revenues have been diminishing. So a combination of these factors of continuing to borrow at high interest rates and continuing this debt-led development strategy, combined with our export sector not performing adequately, has resulted in a situation where the government is now facing what I would say a twin challenge. One is macroeconomic stability, so fiscal stabilization, and secondly in terms of catalyzing growth, because the people need to see the economy grow, and if the economy doesn't grow, macroeconomic stabilization means nothing.
This government came in on a platform for reform. We saw that in the various election manifestos, and most recently we've seen the passage of the Inland Revenue Act, which sought to overhaul the tax system in its initial draft, but has made, let's say, some major changes in the final act. Then we've also seen the introduction of this Vision 2025 plan. Are these measures, or these legislation, these economic policy statements, are these measures carrying Sri Lanka in the direction of reorientation?
Yes. I think the general picture is that reform is needed. I think everyone agrees to that. The pace of reform has been very slow, and those are due to a plethora of political economic factors. However, in terms of the general vision of where the economy is heading and in terms of where government policy is needed, things like the Inland Revenue Bill and things like Vision 2025 are moving towards that reorientation. But at the same time, there needs to be policy consistency. You can't have one or two policies that reorient the government towards, reorient the economy towards an outward orientation, but at the same time kind of look towards more protectionist measures from other sectors. So in terms of reform and the overall reform process, yes, it's a slow process that is heading in the right direction, but there needs to be policy consistency and also the political will in terms of sustaining that reform process, because it's very important when you talk about economic reforms that the people and kind of that the reform process is sustainable, that it doesn't happen just for 2 years but rather a 5, 10 and a longer term period as well.
In talking about economic reforms, it's also important to be considerate of politico-social elements. This government is now midway through its term. It's got 2.5 years left, let's say until the end of 2020, maybe 2021, depending on when elections are called. Given the current political and social climate, do you feel that this reform agenda can be achieved under this government? This reorientation of the economy towards more export diversification, towards seeking sustainable finance for development projects. Can it be achieved?
I think it can be, particularly things like the Inland Revenue Bill, the Foreign Exchange Act, and basically the overall reform of the doing business environment in terms of what the government has planned and what the government is implementing right now, shows that there is a political will towards that process. It has been slow, mostly because, I mean, when you talk about coalition governments, that's a known fact of that reform processes and policy implementation is slow. But at the same time, it's important that these factors don't jeopardize or undermine that reform process, because in every government, in every country, there are parts, there are sectors that want protectionist measures. There are special interest groups that will pressure the policymakers. But in terms of the overall government's vision and in terms of what they've said and what they've been doing on certain aspects, they're showing that that reform process can be sustained. It's what happens after 2021 or after 2020 that is also going to be a question. Will this reform process be sustained by whatever government is in place, because it's important for the country's economy? So regardless of political affiliation, I think it's important that whichever government is in power in the medium to long term has to look at reform seriously.
Kitmira, I also want to ask you, Sri Lanka's fiscal position right now is extremely weak, and in the economy outlook, IPS has suggested the need for sustainable development finance. In the Vision 2025 document, we saw grand plans for development. It almost looks like the government intends to turn Sri Lanka into a upper middle income or upper income country by 2025. Can these projects that are envisaged in this document be sustainably financed? Is it possible?
It is, but for that to happen, it's very important that the private sector plays a very significant role in that. We can't expect the government to fund all these projects on its own, and we can't expect the government to get loans from either domestic sources or outside sources and fund these projects either. A more sustainable option, for example, is public-private partnerships, where the risks and the rewards are distributed between the government and the private sector, and that in itself creates a more sustainable means of finance. At the same time, it's also important that the revenue that we generate gets invested in areas of, for example, capital expenditure, which for healthcare, education, things that bring long-term returns. Right now, almost all of our revenue is used for recurrent expenditure, so that's just things that don't necessarily bring much reward. So in terms of our expenditure as well, we need to be much more careful. We need to consider the economic benefits of expenditure and rationalize that, rather than kind of politically motivated projects and things like that.
On that note, we're going for a short commercial break. When we come back, we'll have more on the topic of public-private partnerships. Can they be successful in Sri Lanka? Welcome back to the program. We're in conversation with Kitmina Hewage of the Institute of Policy Studies, or IPS, regarding their latest economy outlook, which suggests an urgent need for reorientation of Sri Lanka's economy. Kitmina, I'd like to get into the subject of public-private partnerships. In spite of the government's stated objective that it would like to attract more private sector investment, we've seen with instances like Sri Lankan Airlines that this has been very troublesome. What's going wrong, and how can this be fixed?
That's what I said when I started, that we need like broad reforms. So it's not just a matter of an inland revenue bill, or it's not just a matter of kind of one policy factor or kind of reducing VAT or things like that. It's a broad reform process, and particularly in terms of the ease of doing business in the country. Now, if you look at the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, Sri Lanka is ranked around 110th. This looks good when you compare it to South Asian countries, but I think it's high time that Sri Lanka stopped comparing itself to South Asian countries, because those are not the economies that we compete with. We compete with more of the Eastern Asian,
the ASEAN economies,
the Thailands, the Vietnams, and so on, and they are far ahead of us. So when and even if you look closely at the index beyond kind of our ranking, where we do worst is in terms of regulatory policy. So things like enforcing contracts. So it takes, I think the number was 1,000 days for a judicial trial and decision to take place in Sri Lanka, and this is even worse than the South Asian average. Then things like starting businesses, the regulatory processes that are needed to start a business. So things like that. So the ease of doing business environment, it needs reforms in terms of the regulatory processes, and secondly in terms of policy consistency. So it's very important when investors, both local and foreign, look at Sri Lanka, that there is consistency in terms of their policies, because the private sector makes decisions 5 years, 10 years ahead. So for them, that consistency is very important. So if you speak to the private sector, what they'll say is that one of the biggest issues in terms of our competitiveness, and this is reflected even in the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report for Sri Lanka, that policy consistency or policy inconsistency is one of the biggest hindrances. So it's very important. Yes, we speak about public-private partnerships and the private sector's involvement, but for that the government needs to set the necessary regulatory processes and the policy processes that can attract private sector involvement in those areas.
The government has established now a public-private partnership unit, a division of the government that is meant to explore areas of potential public-private partnerships and establish links with the private sector, identify projects where the private sector can contribute. Still, even in spite of those measures as well, there hasn't been much movement in terms of bringing in new PPPs. Is establishing such units basically pointless if the corresponding reforms are not carried out?
I think, to be fair to the unit, it has been established only about a month ago. So I think it's important that we give them enough time to kind of, get their bearings first and then establish and kind of move forward. And even I think it's very important that such units do exist, because if not, what happens is that there is no coordinating body for either the private sector or any government entity who sees fit for a PPP without such a unit handling it. Otherwise, we have to go through multiple ministries and so on. So it's important that that unit exists and such units exist. But like you said, yes, it's important at the same time that regardless of the unit, you need the reform processes and the policy reforms that need to happen on a greater scale. But to be fair, I think the existence of such a unit and the vision of such a unit would help with the reform process as well, if it is empowered to do so.
On the subject of the public-private partnership unit, the reason that I asked this question is because Sri Lanka does have a board of investments, which when it was established was envisaged as a one-stop shop for foreign direct investment coming into the country. Now we've seen, along with the BOI, there's also been established the Agency for Development, and now as of a month ago we have the PPP unit. Don't the mandates of these three organizations sort of conflict with each other, and doesn't that contribute to the sort of regulatory red tape that is holding back Sri Lanka's progress in having a better business environment for doing business?
I think in terms of the public-private partnership, their mandate is somewhat exclusive to that of the BOI and even for the Agency for Development, because that looks at a very micro look at how the government can get the private sector involved in their own projects. So in terms of contract negotiations, in terms of contract development, in terms of finding those particular investors and so on. I think it's a more kind of nuanced area of skills that are needed for that. And I think that in terms of the BOI and the Agency for Development, I think it's a case of mainstreaming or streamlining that process, and I think there is talk and there is discussions in terms of how to navigate this. There's some overlap which needs to be streamlined, and in terms of where the jurisdiction or where who makes decisions and that sort of thing has to happen. So I think the thing with reforms is that you can't pick and choose policies that you like and also don't like. Like, you know, the reform process is such that there will be growing pains, and I hope that this is one of those growing pains that will be addressed moving forward in terms of the mandate overlap.
Kipina, you also mentioned, you also spoke about government expenditure and recurrent expenditure earlier on in the program. A lot of that recurrent expenditure goes towards welfare. For example, programs like Samruddhi. My question is, it would be difficult to scale back on such welfare programs, not only because of political needs, but also because of social needs. For some families in the country, the Samruddhi allowance that they receive is invaluable, as small as that allowance is. How can the government address its sort of spending issues without having a harmful impact on welfare programs?
I think in terms of that, the government needs to look at where its expenditure is actually going into. So things like welfare are a necessary factor in an economy, particularly in developing economies such as Sri Lanka's. But at the same time, there are certain areas within those programs that certain inefficiencies can be addressed. So even within the Samruddhi program, even though the scheme is important to the people, there may be certain implementation inefficiencies that take place, and those can reduce costs. But at the same time, in terms of government expenditure overall, we look at things like state-owned enterprises that don't necessarily bring much revenue. Things like Sri Lankan Airlines, for example, is that it's a massive boon to the Sri Lankan economy, that the money outflow is not, we don't get a necessary return to the economy. So in terms of state-owned enterprises, I think the Sri Lankan economy needs to recognize that there are certain areas, there are certain sectors that government should not be engaged in, government should not be part of. And that is where state-owned enterprise reform is important, and the government needs to look at that sort of expenditure at the same time so that it doesn't necessarily compromise on the welfare of the people.
Is that a realistic expectation, though, for the government to realize that there are some sectors that it should not be involved in, aside from being regulators?
I mean, it is, because most countries do it. Most countries realize that there
are... most countries. Is it a realistic expectation of Sri Lankan governments, regardless of whether it's a pro-business government or whether it's... there seems to be always a need on the part of the government to be involved, to be entrepreneurs.
That need is also driven by the voters, isn't it? So I think we vote for governments expecting the governments to be entrepreneurs in certain areas as well. So I think if the people recognize the need for the governments to be more rational in their expenditure, then I think politicians and policymakers will also follow suit.
Keeping one last question before I let you go, we're running out of time. If the government, if the state does not move in the direction of reorienting the economy in terms of diversifying exports, sourcing sustainable finance for its development projects, rationalizing its expenditure, what's the worst case scenario?
Well, in the medium to long run, our debt is around the 27 billion mark, and about 5 billion of that is expected to be paid, settled in 2019. So there is urgent need in terms of the short run to make sure that we have the resources to pay those debts, or kind of see how we can address those debts as well. But in the long run, if we don't reorient our economy, I don't think we need to look much further than, I mean, there are very clear examples in Europe, in Latin America, where the fact that the reforms didn't happen in time has led to a lot worse. So the cost that you may have right now in terms of reforms hurt a lot less right now if we do those reforms, whereas the cost of not making those reforms and then being debt ridden, not being able to pay those debts, and then the economy, requiring large scale overall reform or overall kind of
massive austerity.
Massive austerity and things like that. So it's a case of, do we pass the buck every 5 years,
or do we take responsibility and
do it now?
Kitmil, thank you very much for coming on Biz1st Review 360. It's been a pleasure to have you. So there you have it. Do we pass the buck on every 5 years, or are we going to take responsibility and get the job done now? And that's a wrap of our program tonight. Don't forget to look us up on Facebook. You'll find us at Biz1st Review 360, 1 and 360 in numerals. I'll see you again, same time, same place next week. Until then, good night and good luck.